And also in the process, China, yes, the economy will take a hit. To what extent, we don't know, but there's a lot of people thinking that it'll collapse the Chinese economy and bring the Chinese government down. Well, it won't, and they need to remember supply chains that come from China. So if you think China's economy is going to get hit, well, don't forget the hit that your own economy is going to take. The US, of course, being a prime example.
Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics. And with so many fascinating things happening in the world, the coronavirus, which has a lot of people concerned, rightly so, although a lot of people confused about what's real or not. And certainly that's a theme that plays into our politics, our financial markets. So excited to have London Paul of the Sirius Report. Link to the Sirius Report in the description below. Fortunate to have Paul joining me on the show again. Gave a great interview last year. And before we get started, if you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, then you can be notified as soon as I am fortunate to have guests like Paul on. So with that intro out of the way, Paul, it's great to have you on here again today. And how are you doing, my friend?
Well, yeah, it's a real pleasure to be back. And yeah, likewise, how are you? I'm fine. And how are you?
Doing well. It's certainly fascinating times in the world. And we're going to dig into the whole deep state Trump nonsense and the financial markets as well. Although I know you mentioned you have a biology background, and certainly a lot of people getting concerned about the coronavirus. My thought is that by all means, I'm not to downplay it, and I'm not saying that I'm doing that, although I've seen how there's a lot of fear out there, even separate from what may actually be happening. It seems like there's a lot of people who are very fearful and concerned, which, you know, we know how the politics get involved in generating that element. So perhaps to start off, you could dig in and separate any fact from fiction. Again, I'll point out that you did live in China for a while, so folks can be aware of that. And I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, well, let's try and break this down. And I appreciate that what I say is not going to resonate with some people, and in fact, it might upset other people. But we have to deal with realities. We've had enough of the illusion, and we can't clearly understand absolutely everything. But as you said, from my background, I mean, I was originally a physicist. I then did a PhD in biophysics, which studies and actually resolves molecular structures of things. And I did that including viruses. So I'm not a virologist, I have to say that, but I have a good understanding of viruses, and therefore feel I'm in a better position to comment on things. I don't deal with the hysteria side and the fear. I don't suggest it's going to be a pandemic all over the globe or anything like that, because that's not who I am. I'm not here to make those kind of comments. But there's certain things I think we do need to say. Look, the only way you can effectively resolve the issue of a virus, you have to have strict quarantine. And people have been complaining in the West about all these apparently draconian things happening to the Chinese people, which largely isn't true. And the Chinese people are pretty sanguine about it and understand the position. And by doing this will prevent the spread of the virus, and also ultimately prevent the spread of the virus globally as a result of it. And also in the process, China, yes, the economy will take a hit. To what extent, we don't know, but there's a lot of people thinking that it'll collapse the Chinese economy and bring the Chinese government down. Well, it won't, and they need to remember supply chains that come from China. So if you think China's economy is going to get hit, well, don't forget the hit that your own economy is going to take. The US, of course, being a prime example. And the other thing is, there's a lot of this anti-Chinese sentiment that I first stated would happen when it became obvious the Belt and Road was becoming more and more of obvious development. And also because China's de-dollarizing, China's dumping treasuries that have been siloed inside the system to prevent people being aware of that. And China, of course, is buying enormous amounts of gold and has enormous amounts of gold, as we've discussed previously. So they're everything that the US deep state or financial system, etc., doesn't want to see happening. So they clearly, this anti-Chinese sentiment is spread out of the kind of deep state and is now becoming a kind of mainstream. And unfortunately, alt media has been gripped by this as well. But as I always say, people in the West don't believe their governments. The alt media have been a great example of that. But apparently, they always believe that their government tells them the truth about China and Russia, etc. And I think it's about time people started to question everything, including, am I being told the truth about what goes on in China and Russia, etc.? And because a lot of it simply is nonsense. With regards to a lot of stuff that's come out of China, there's certainly fake videos. Some are true, some are valid, but there are fake videos and claims being made to try and present the Chinese government in a bad light. The other thing is that whatever people think this anti-Chinese sentiment is, it was originally driven as a deep state agenda because they wanted to try and create this global opinion against China because they don't want the spread of the Belt and Road. They don't want the spread of Chinese influence and the internationalization of the yuan, etc. But it's foolish to do this because the world doesn't believe it. And also, if people think castigating the Chinese government's going to influence the Chinese people, well, it does, but the reverse to what they think, it actually galvanizes the Chinese people around their government because whatever qualms they have about their government, they're far more angry about Western people castigating their nation and making statements that are factually incorrect. I mean, and there's been some scientific statements made with regards to the virus. I mean, and I saw one thing where people were going about all these huge levels of sulfur dioxide in Wuhan, and somehow this was attributable to organic matter. Well, that is simply untrue. It's to do with fossil fuels and the smelting of ores. And if people think it's to do with apparently incinerating all these people, well, the human body contains fractions of 1% of sulfur. We're 99% carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, etc., etc. So, let's deal with scientific reality. And if the death rates and the infection rates are being rigged, as people would like to say, why are we not seeing far higher cases in the rest of the world? Why, in percentile terms, are we seeing some correlation between what we're being told in China by the Chinese and what Western governments are telling? Or are we to believe that Western governments are in cahoots with the Chinese? Well, clearly not. And a lot of these claims are being driven, as I say, by this anti-Chinese stance. Now, let's look at coincidences, because people will say, well, Wuhan has a level 4 laboratory, which is true, and in close proximity to the lab was where the epicenter. And then there's the timing, because it was around the Chinese New Year. And yes, you can argue there are coincidences, but then that doesn't automatically attribute to the fact that the virus came from the lab, because level 4 labs are incredibly secure. You could not accidentally release a virus from a level 4 lab. You might be able to do things maliciously, but that is incredibly difficult to do as well. So I don't think there's any validity in saying that. The historical perspective is from SARS in the early 2000s, it was related to bats. Now, if you want to criticize the Chinese for anything, and I'm hugely critical of this, is the sort of regulations around how they eat wildlife as a delicacy. The rules and regulations are not observed. They put them in place, but they're not enforced. And it's very likely that the coronavirus entered the food chain via bats or maybe some other wildlife. And people will say, oh, but there's this, we saw in the coronavirus how there's this section that relates to HIV virus. Well, people need to understand bats are resistant to these viruses. So it doesn't affect them. It can be, for example, passed through the food chain. And it's perfectly likely that if they're immune to viruses, you can have a mutation, and therefore that would account for this small section of what people saw as HIV. So there are scientific reasons to dismiss that. Then we come to was it a bioweapon or not? Well, the question is, who's responsible? Is it the CIA plotting something or something like that, or is it the Chinese? I mean, The idea China would release a virus on its own people just falls flat on its face, because that would cause huge economic damage, potentially far worse than maybe what it ever transpires to be. China would not do that. That's not something that would be in China's interest whatsoever.
Right.
As for the theory that the CIA had done it, or some similar Western intelligence agency, is just wonderful conspiracy theory. Back it up with proof. And worse, that you can't just make statements and say, well, that's reality. So more than likely it entered the food chain, and through negligence. And that may seem a very boring explanation for most people. It may not resonate with people, but already, whether you believe it or not, there is clear evidence inside China that outside Wuhan, that the number of cases is dropping off. Even in Wuhan it is, which it's early days, but within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, we may see that the virus starts to drop off inside China. It doesn't mean it will, but in all likelihood, as data stands, and that data can change. And yes, there was that day when there was an enormous spike in data. Everyone went, oh, see, look, they've been rigging the figures. Well, yeah, there was figures that should have been accounted for in Wuhan only. The rest of China was doing things correctly. So yeah, we saw this enormous spike. And then the following day, it just tailed off to the general trend, which was in a decreasing capacity for some time. So it was just a blip because Wuhan didn't account for things correctly, which was something the Chinese government dealt with very quickly, and they sacked a whole bunch of people for their incompetence in doing so. And yes, I'm not going to get involved in all the conspiracy about how it started and all these accusations, because, as I always say, people have to back this up with factual proof and evidence, not just suppositions, largely based on many people's jaundiced view of China. And some people think they can jump on the bandwagon and create all these situations that are going to bring about the downfall of China. Well, it won't. It's most certainly going to impact their economy, and we'll understand that more in the coming weeks and months, and depending on how long this virus persists. But certain parts of the Chinese economy are starting to get back on their feet. But yes, there's going to be an impact, but there's also now going to be an impact in the West. So my view on it is we have to wait and see. I think there's a risk that you will see increases in the West now as a consequence, but we need to get away from a lot of this hysterical kind of stories about pandemics and all these conspiracy theories as to what the origins were, because there isn't the scientific evidence to support this. If you talk to virologists, I've actually had conversations with virologists, and that's their job. They more or less agree with my assertion. Now, you could say we're all mistaken, but the science has to win through on this first and foremost, and the rest will follow accordingly. But every time there's some event in the world now, there's always this belief in that there's a conspiracy behind it, and then all these elaborate stories come out, and then it got spun into a way of attacking China and trying to convince the Chinese people that the Chinese government failed in all these accounts. Well, and it all happened because apparently there was all these riots planned in China. Well, there wasn't riots planned in China. That simply isn't true. And there's just this desire to try and see the fall of China. And I have to comment one more thing. It is deplorable to see people almost cheering the fact that China has suffered this. And there are people who've sadly lost their lives, and people who've suffered quite a lot, to varying degrees due to the severity of the virus. This is despicable attitude, and some people need to look hard in the mirror and ask themselves why they're doing this, because that is not how you treat human beings. That's not how you would, perceive as an acceptable attitude. And actually, just as a side note to put in this, at the Munich Security Conference, it was said to me that there was some American official, I don't know who it was, who actually said, oh, we could turn this coronavirus to our advantage and maybe have regime change inside Beijing. Now, that kind of mentality is A, farcical, and B, it caused a huge amount of shock inside the Munich Security Conference. But this kind of attitude has to end. We're all human beings. We all live on this planet. And this is part of the American idea that we have to win at all costs, and you're either with us or against us. Well, the world's changing, and that attitude no longer applies, and especially doesn't apply to something like a coronavirus, which potentially could have been a lot worse. And the Chinese deserve an enormous amount of credit for preventing it becoming far bigger problem inside their own country, and conversely being a far bigger issue outside the country.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that there were people who were actually cheering it, which is bizarre to me. Along the same lines where it's sometimes bizarre to me that if some guy's standing on the other side of the room and we've been friends all of our lives and he happens to be Russian and I'm born on this piece of land, that I'm supposed to dislike the guy, or just that whole school of thought. But as you pointed out, where you're hearing, well, maybe we could use this to regime change. I guess that's why when I first heard it, again, and I like to be careful of, like you said, not creating conspiracy theories yet. I think why a lot of people wonder if the CIA is involved is that it certainly does fit the pattern of things that they have done, which again, I also believe in not looking for false positives, because that can be damaging too. And anyway, just appreciate you shedding some light on that. And perhaps maybe the best thing is just sending some warm prayers and wishes for people to be all right, because Paul, as I understand it, like you mentioned, just the hysteria and the frantic or anger or whatever those emotions, that actually makes it more of a risk, because that weakens our immune system when we're in that state of mind. Is that right?
Well, yes, that's very true, and you make a point. Look, yes, there is historical context for why people might want to believe it's the CIA, but I mean, the Chinese never act in haste. Let's be honest about that. They're very controlled and measured in their response. And I have made the point that you people in the West better hope it's not a Western bioweapon, because China's response will be severe. But I don't hear or see any evidence that China thinks it's a bioweapon. In fact, they've done everything to try and calm that belief. There's a lot of people where they've been very critical of Western comments to that effect, and I think they've done enough to suggest they don't see it as being a bioweapon. And let's be honest, I mean, people will argue they may be under a certain amount of duress in their own country because of this. Well, if they wanted to take the heat off their shoulders, they could very conveniently blame somebody else for this in the eyes of the Chinese people, and they haven't done that, and they've not given even a hint that they think that's the case. And to be honest, the SARS virus was introduced through the food chain. There's a precedent for this, and therefore sometimes we just have to accept, in this crazy world we live in now, that nature still does exist. I mean, because if you believe social media, nature doesn't exist anymore to a large extent. Everything's man-made. No, nature's still a powerful force, and I think the criticism of the Chinese should be around the fact of how wildlife is a delicacy, and if you don't deal with things in an appropriate manner, you can introduce risk into the food chain, and there's certainly a precedent for that as well. So, I mean, yeah, look, we don't have absolute definitive proof, but the science tends to prove what I'm saying is the case, and I have to go with the science in this regard. I mean, otherwise, if I get drawn into the conspiracy, I'm throwing all the science in the bin. And this is one situation where it's not geopolitical, and there's a lot of leeway in terms of our understanding. This is the scientific fact to bear out what we're saying. And if people don't want to believe the scientific fact, well, that's fine. But that is where it is, and I'm standing by that. And thus far, what I'm seeing is playing out how I expect it to be. I said on my own podcast that there might be evidence in the next couple of weeks where we start to see a tail off in China, and we've seen that. So that's my basis on scientific evidence. So it's panning out so far. It remains to be seen, but we have to be a little bit careful in this world that there are genuine conspiracy theories. But amongst all this, we're in an age now where we have to seek the truth. And the truth is, the only thing that's going to get us through this, we've spent a lifetime dealing with illusion in the West on every level we can imagine. I'm not going to add to that level of illusion. And if people don't want to believe it, that's fine. I'm not here to tell people what to believe, but the process will pan out the way it's going to pan out. And if it pans out how I expect, that will be pretty much definitive proof that it was a genuine virus. And here's the other thing: if they wanted to introduce a bioweapon, they could have put something far nastier than the coronavirus. Now, you can argue that ultimately the weapon was designed to damage the Chinese economy, but if you use something like a coronavirus, it's very hit and miss if that's your intention. If they wanted to put a bioweapon, they could have put something far nastier, which would have had far more devastating effects. So, what you're going to put a bioweapon in, but it's very benign in relative terms. That doesn't really stack up. I mean, bear in mind, if it was a bioweapon that the CIA were introducing into China, it's out of massive desperation. Now, if you're really desperate, you don't go for the softly approach. You go for the jugular, wouldn't you?
So that's part one of my interview with London Paul. And if you enjoyed that one, you're definitely going to want to hear what he had to say about China and the gold market, what's really happening, especially interesting as we've seen the gold price rise in recent days. So go ahead and click the button to watch that next video now.